Welcome to Laurier's Teaching Excellence Conversation Series. I'm Deborah Van Eyneton, Academic Director of Teaching Excellence and Innovation at Wilfrid Laurier University. And today I'm with Jeremy Hunsinger from Laurier's Communication Studies Department. Jeremy received the 2024 Innovation in Teaching Award. With courses built around creating a studio-like learning environment, Jeremy fosters active engagement and critical thinking among his students. His approaches to teaching include involving students in the development of their syllabus and helping them reach consensus on the ways that they'll engage and be assessed in his courses. Jeremy empowers students to take ownership of their own learning journey and creates personalized and impactful experiences that shape his students in ways that go far beyond course content. And I'm excited to talk to him today. So, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me here today. There are so many wonderful things about your nomination package, but one of the things that really stands out is how you encourage students to take ownership of their own learning. And the example that I think of right away is where you involve on, I think, day one, students in the creation of their syllabus, right? Or certainly expectations of what they think they should be able to see in the syllabus and what they want out of the course.
Right.
So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
You know, it's something I had, to give, I don't know where I found it from, on a blog years ago.
I was going to ask you what,
It
where
was
you
a
got that
mathematician's
idea.
blog who basically said, if you're going to have an active learning course, in day one, you have to start with active learning.
Yeah.
If you sit there and you have them you're reading the syllabus with them and that's not active learning, and that's not anything they're actually even doing. Most of them are just sitting there quietly.
Or they're tuning out.
Yeah,
And
you're
they're
right.
tuning out.
Sitting there quietly. I don't know what they're actually doing. If it was me, I would probably be playing something in my mind, doing math in my mind, whatever entertains me, But they're doing the same thing that I would have done because I've either memorized the syllabus already or I've read it for what I needed to get and I've made my notes or that. So I asked them, the question that they're faced with is individually is what isn't in the syllabus that you need to know, right? So they all need to know things. And if you look at my syllabi, I would never say they're the most professionally well done. In fact, they aren't. They have errors on purpose. And the errors are there to let them know that I make mistakes, they make mistakes. Mistakes aren't a problem. We can all learn from mistakes. But there's things, if they want to know them, there's spaces in there for them to have things. So they'll frequently ask things that are in the syllabus, and I'll just say it's in the syllabus.
And so how do they react?
And so they're supposed to go relook it up.
And do they? Do they take it seriously?
I don't have, all my friends, they say they get all these emails about it's in the syllabus. I don't have that. Because they, basically they read the syllabus. They ask, the process is very simple. They read the syllabus. They ask any questions they have in the syllabus. They talk about those questions with their peers. And then they either tell me those by raising their hand or they write them on the board, depending on how big the class is. If it's think, pair, share, it's 2 people. If it's a large class, it's 5 people. But the one person is writing them on the board for a large class. And then I just go and answer them. And there's no negativity or anything about answering them. There's just, the knowledge is there. Like, we can share it. You just have to ask. And that's one of the things. It fits in with the other part of my class, which is not every student likes this, but at the start of every class, I will answer any question posed that I think is worth answering. And they have to ask those questions on note cards at the end of the prior class. Or they can send them an email, and I will just answer them. And a secret here is sometimes I make those questions up myself to feed in stuff that I don't think they're understanding. So they're not going to ask me a question about what hegemony is, right? They're just not. It's not not their vocabulary. They'll ask me what the names of my
It's
cats
key
are.
to understanding so much.
Right.
Yeah.
At a second year, they're not going to ask that question. So I might say, I'll just say as if one of them asked it, and that's fine, and it engages them in thinking about what this concept is. But frequently they do ask questions about all kinds of things related to the class, related to things going on at the university, related to the wider world, and they're things, and they're allowed to do that, any question. And I will try to answer them, and I will sometimes say, I do not know, because that's another thing they need to know is that
Absolutely, you're not,
we don't know.
all-knowing.
So, so it's that sort of continual, like, I am the person that will help answer your questions. I am not the person to sort of tell you the way the world is. Sort of construction that I'm going for, because active learning in my classroom is a constructivist activity, right? We're building knowledge. I'm an SDSer. I believe that science, knowledge, everything is built through social interaction and interaction with the world. That's the way we come to know and come to think. And so what we're doing in this first exercise is basically transferring from me telling them the way the world is to them saying, we need this. And then that's the sort of thing from then out, they always have like, we need more information here. And we need more things to like on this. And, and then, they'll raise their hand, they'll call me over. If it's something I think everybody needs to know, I will answer it when we're doing active learning, right?
So that's a great segue to your philosophy of creating a studio-like environment in the classroom. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, how's that different than sort of the traditional, or our notion of the traditional post-secondary classroom?
Well, I don't lecture at all, right? It's all about them leading and developing their own knowledge. So I give them activities to do, and I don't use the term studio with them because I don't think they would necessarily have that context, most of them, some of them, or they would have it in an artistic context. Studio for me is like an environmental design studio. It's like, here's a problem you have. How do we solve it? Here's 6 different teams. Let's try and solve it. Now, in communication studies, we don't really have those sorts of things from the theoretical perspectives that we tend to teach. But we do have questions of how to relate what they're learning to jobs they might have in the future. We have questions of how to apply the knowledge and theories they're doing to actually analyzing and developing new knowledges. We have all kinds of things that they can do in the classroom, and that's sort of the design thing. So to give them an undefined sort of space where they can be free enough to use the materials that they can gather to make knowledge, right?
And you're giving them things ahead of time, or you're prepping them ahead of time, and then they're applying it in the classroom?
I still use reading reviews. So they have to read a fair amount in my classes, and they turn in the reading reviews before the class, and I mark those as either it demonstrates clearly that they've done the reading or some other level, or they've surpassed that basic standard. But that's the basic standard. They have to demonstrate that they've done the readings in the reading review. And then that's the knowledge they build on. But I also don't just build on that knowledge, because what I find at almost every course from my high school on up, elementary wasn't sort of like this, but high school on up, it's like people don't call out to other courses. Like, when was the last time you heard somebody that said, how does this relate to other courses you've taught? You don't see that very often. So I started integrating that into my classes. It's like, integrate the other knowledges. I started doing it in reading reviews. Put these readings in the context of your prior classes. And so they started doing that. Of course, a lot of them will do it very lightly by just like a quick, this relates to, but that's not really the goal. But then integrating that into the classes to sort of show them that the curriculum has more meaning than just random things. Things build, things construct, and you're actually developing a set of knowledges that you can use. Tools to think with is a phrase that I'll frequently use in my classes. I think I stole that from Ivan Illich. And those are things that our students don't necessarily think they have, but they have all kinds of tools in their tool belt. They just don't know where to use them.
And you're getting them to reach back into prior communication studies courses, and maybe cultural studies courses, or
women,
anything.
gender studies, anything they've had before, they can use again. If they've had my other courses, they can certainly use those techniques again. And, that's sort of the goal of building up, their background in sort of the liberal arts tradition is to say, it's not all unrelated disjoint knowledges. It's not like a series of TikTok videos. It's like there is a narrative to almost every class, whether the professor admits it or not,
Mhm.
right? There is a structure that they put into that class, whether they're going to tell you it or not. They hope you recognize it, and and we hope that you recognize the structure to your degree. But I'm actually, stealing from Pierre Bourdieu, science is science plus reflexivity. Without the reflexivity of them thinking back, how are they going to be able to think forward? How are
Mhm.
they going to be able to actually critique, last year's work without, or this year's work, auto-critique. So they need to have that reflexivity of thinking about what they've done before. And I think that's part of it. So the studio is sort of more of a concept in my mind and the way to communicate shorthand in the learning, um, you know, uh, philosophy, a description that appeals, right? Because it creates a sense of imagination too. When I tell that to colleagues, it's like, how would you do a communication studies studio? And I've done things that are much more studio-like. I do this making and communication class, which I haven't done in a few years, which is very much just, you're going to make something real in this class. And it's going to be whatever problem you define, you're going to have a solution to it by the end, after 8 weeks. Um, and they do. It's amazing, but they do. And like I have other people come and look at some of the things they've done, and some of them have been quite amazing. Some of them are very pedestrian, but that's everybody's life, right? It's like some people are aiming to solve a really big problem, and one student was just trying to figure out a way for her cousin to open doors because they're in a
Oh,
wheelchair,
wheelchair.
and most of the
Oh,
doors in their community didn't have buttons. Like, that's a great thing to do.
yeah, yeah.
Figure it out. Think about a tool. Develop a tool.
So I wonder if I can follow up on
Mhm.
that because, something else that you do across your courses is you're getting students to engage with the world around them,
Mhm.
which is really great, through active learning
Yeah.
exercises, but, you know, um, but in different ways. And your networked and digital culture exercise, that is really innovative, very unique, and it happens over several classes. And in reading about this in your dossier, I kept thinking to myself, how to maintain energy and student interest over the course of, several classes when you've got students that are working at different, paces, and they're grasping things differently and they're interpreting things differently, right? But they're learning
Mhm.
actively. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that exercise.
There's a few tricks of the trade there. The main thing is you never give them more than one assignment at a time, and it's completed before the next one is started.
Yeah.
So it might go over many
Everyone can
classes.
complete it.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
all the groups.
Because some students always rush ahead. They
Yeah,
always want to
well, if you give them every stage, they're like
yeah,
everybody, like one group will be finished like in 15 minutes, and it will not be well done.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
we've all talked about philosophies of slowness. Everybody's thought about slowness. There's a book there called The Slow Professor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm supposed to be
Slow
writing a
research.
slow
I went to a
research.
workshop on slow
You know,
research. Yeah.
I'm supposed to be working on something in that area, which I'll eventually get to. Um, but really, forcing them to slow down is one of the best things we can do. And like getting them to engage and telling them, no, you should still be engaged with this. If you aren't still engaged with this, there's probably something in there that you're missing. So keep working at it, keep thinking about it, keep talking about it. And they will keep working um, up until sort of, there's the discussion of boredom that they all have. And they're like, we're bored of it. Like, and I tell them, boredom is a thing you create in your own mind. You know this. This is a choice you make to feel bored. It's not something that comes upon
So
you.
what is their response to that?
They're like,
Oh,
oh, it's like, yeah, it's literally that. Because until somebody tells you that you don't have to feel bored anytime, you can do other things. Like you're perfectly free to like think about other things, think more deeply about this, uh, do more on this project. There's nothing boring implicitly about this project.
no, it's a very
Right,
cool
right,
project, right? They're
right.
creating an art
Yeah, right.
installation.
Right. Yeah, and many of our students love it. And there's going to be a few that don't love it. And,
Yeah.
there's no problem with that. Um, but they still have to do it. And when they don't want to do it, Well, then you ask them, it's like, how does it relate to other things you want to do, right? If you don't think the building an art installation is something you're going to do in your future career, and it very well might not be something, it's a very small minority of people that do this in their career.
Yeah.
How does it relate to anything you might want to do in your career? How does it relate to laying out a very important report that you're going to have to create? How does it relate to, any number of things that require a sense of decision in social context, right? You just don't put things together because, you have your own internal sense. You put things together for a community, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And everything you do has an audience, and we're communication studies, and you are thinking about audience. So what about this? How are you going to do this? And this allows them to hopefully engage more deeply.
And they're working, are they working in groups together?
Yeah. And so you also have the problems of, sometimes
Group work.
only one person shows up for the group.
Yes.
And recently, of course, we have the problem of, there is attendance in my classes, so they have to attend. And I think it's something that should be very real because the class is where it happens, right?
Yeah.
But then again,
especially a class that is, there's no lecturing, it's devoted to
Right.
active learning and exercises.
so they have to be there and be, but some of them aren't there. Some of them have a big test the next day, and that's all understandable. They send their apologies to their colleagues, and you have this one student sitting there working alone, and and so you have to go and motivate them and keep their energy up, and and if it happens a lot, then you can say, shift to another group. There's no necessity beyond your social relations to these people that you work with them. You can work with other people. There's no punishment in changing group. There's nothing like that. It's all fluid if they want it to be fluid. Frequently they don't want it to be fluid because stability. And one of the lessons of group work is stability.
Like structure.
Oh yes, students love a brilliantly laid out lecture where they only have to take notes and don't have to do anything else except read those notes 3 times and pass the test.
Right.
They love that, right? The question is whether they learned anything in that. Well, they learned how to take notes, and they learned how to read notes, and they learned maybe some of the concepts. But I also suspect, as almost all of us know, and as we know ourselves, humans are professional forgetters, right? If we don't find something useful to retain that we can do things with, we will forget it. So that's where I think active learning comes in. And as we know, the research shows active learning works. Active learning makes them learn the material. Maybe not all equitably at the same level of depth, but they all have more of a sense than just being told what things are.
And what are the steps in creating the art installation?
To be honest, I make most of them up step by step on the fly, and then I go back and edit them after the fact.
But they have to conceive an idea, and then they have to put together a plan.
Yeah, for the first one, it's like
do some creating.
The dialectic in this course is between the networks in their life and the networks in Japan. So something alien with, there's a beautiful ethnography of Japan on the railroads in Japan. And so they talk about art in one chapter of that in some relation, so that it sprung out of there. It's like, I can do this. And frequently we have students, well, almost all of our students are creatively inclined in some way, and so it seems clear to me that this would be an engaging topic for some of them, and I just came up with a multi-stage process of them developing. It's basically designed to be almost as reflexive as I could make it be. So you start off with design an artwork, then find Canadian artworks to fit that in, and then find the next level is another reflexive level. So them to think about the relations beyond that, and think about their audience beyond that, and think about how they reconstruct it and what galleries they would put it in, to learn about the international or Canadian gallery scenes. So they have to bring it all together. And
that's a really cool exercise.
Yeah, I think it's cool. It's fun. I'm sure somebody else is doing it in the world somewhere, but I haven't seen it. This is the only one that I've seen that does like this, and it's basically designed to reflexively get them to think about networks, right?
Yeah.
And how the
Yeah.
art world, I think Arthur Danto said that the art world is primarily networks at one point, when he was trying to define, the nature of art back in the day when I took my one aesthetics course
Yeah.
in
And it's a
university.
great way to talk
Yeah.
about hierarchies versus
Right.
networks.
Right. And
What that means for culture,
Yeah.
cultural interactions, power relations.
It's all
All
built
of the
in.
above.
It's all
Yeah.
in there, and it's all about how far they want to go and how far they want to think it. That's a 200 level course. And so this is for a 200 level course, it's really getting them
Yeah, that's
so many.
challenging them.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
This would work equally well on a 300 or 400 level course where they had many more theoretical tools, right?
Yeah. You were talking before about, there are, for the networked assignment, there may be some students for whom, it's not clear they're going to use it in their career, but think about it. I mean, one of the things that we know all of our students are going to use is technology. And you engage students with technology in a whole bunch of different ways. So I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, that's what, the job advertisement was critical internet studies. What they brought me here to do was to teach about the internet and teach about new technologies. And that's what I do. I mean, it's like I was just having a conversation with a colleague about AI in the classroom.
I was going to bring it up.
And it's like, and he's like,
Big
what
challenge.
about privacy? It's like, well, this has been since this year, 1976 was when we started arguing about this one. These are not new debates around these technologies. What about IP? Well, that's not a new debate either. It's like the challenge of AI for me right now is that you cannot say no anymore because it is in all their laptops.
Yep.
It is built into their watches even. Like you cannot like say you can't use AI. That's not the question. I don't really think it's even AI. It's machine learning and it's really predictive language production. But in the extent that that's there, it's like we were having a discussion online with I think a colleague from Texas Tech, and he's like, well, yeah, I mean, maybe this will stop all the complaints about our students being bad writers when they graduate, because there's always that complaint, because universities train students to be good writers of university material, but that doesn't mean you're going to be a good writer in a business, right?
No, right. Yeah.
But
or a community organization.
Or anything else you're doing, right? And so, or learning how to write. I mean, some of our public communication courses teach them how to write for various public institutions and things like this. But not everybody teaches. I mean, most of us have no experience outside of the universities, or very little experience outside the universities, right?
We spent our careers inside.
In some element of that.
My husband and I like to tell our kids that we started going to university and we never left. So, but in terms of
to bring back to the technology, right?
Yeah.
So
are you using it? Are you getting them to use AI in the classroom?
Yeah, I've taught a course entirely about them using AI in the classroom. My basic approach to it is like, well, instead of teaching them not to do it, I'm going to teach them how to do it and get them to do a really interesting project doing it. So we had,
and also to recognize its weaknesses.
Yeah.
It has,
innumerable creative problems.
Yes.
It's like, there are certain keywords you can look in any essay which automatically indicate it's probably written by AI.
Yeah.
And if they're there.
But getting them to recognize it, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, they use any and every technology. I mean, the first technology we have is, the word, right? The word, logos. That's the basis of technology. It's like I actually have dissertation defense I have to do tomorrow, where one of the debates is like, you define technology so broadly that everything is technology, which is not a problem, but then you also have to quickly define what is not technology.
Right, right.
Which is something I do in my 213 Technology and Society course. So, students have to think about what they're using, the tools they're using, and why they're using them. We can go back to Ivan Illich on this, tools of conviviality, the tools that make our life worth living, right? That's what you should be thinking about, not the tools that make make it easier for me to take notes, because the computer taking notes for you isn't making your life easier. It's going to make your life harder in the long run because you don't know how to take notes. And taking notes is part of the ways that your mind works, or your mind can work very efficiently that way. So learning how to do and use the technology to make your life better, more meaningful, more convivial, more social.
So
That's
how do you
fine.
illustrate that or how do you get them to the place where they recognize that?
Oh, that they might get that by the time they graduate.
Mm-hmm.
They'll get that a little in
Because they're using different
353.
tools in your
Yeah,
classes. Yeah.
like in internet studies, they'll get that fairly strongly. Um,
What are they doing in the internet studies
well,
class?
they're
How do you get
introduced
there?
to basically three different theories of the internet, and then the second half of the course is to look at case examples week by week of specific technologies on the internet. So I think they do AI, virtual reality, and other things,
Okay, great.
and
Just
they have to
wanted
think deeply about sort
examples.
of how these relate.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the internet might be a thing, it might not be anything anymore, but you know, uh, it's like refrigerators. It's like there's been probably in the last 20 years 10 books written on refrigeration. Refrigeration is the backbone of our civilization, along with sanitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody writes about it
Mm-hmm.
in the social sciences much anymore. But, and people are writing about the internet, and people do write interesting things about the internet. There's a whole association that I helped found on that, the Association of Internet Researchers. So I'm not going to say people aren't doing it. It's just that in the students' everyday life, they aren't thinking about the internet as a category.
Yeah.
They're thinking about
Yeah.
whatever platform interface they have. And so the question is, when you're talking about something like TikTok, it's like, how is it making your life better?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm exposed to new popular culture trends. It's like, yes, but does that make your life better in any way? I get to talk about things with my fellow students. Yes, but what if you didn't have those categories from the popular culture? What could you talk about otherwise? That's something for them to think about. Um, and then, I always like to have the discussion is like, who owns what's in your brain, right? Like, who owns that intellectual property? You know, one of the old studies is like by the
Now,
time you're 5 years old,
that's
you know more like logos than you know words,
mm-hmm.
right? It's like think about what you're absorbing there and who controls that and what they're trying to get out of it. Why do people assign like such negative things to poverty? Who makes that a negative thing? I mean, none of us want to be poor, but who creates a social stigma around it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's a long-term
Mm-hmm.
political project
Mm-hmm.
of certain, perhaps, classes of people,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not something
Yeah.
that just happened, right? Like people just didn't decide. This is a political, goal to keep that sort of structure in capitalism. Why is that? Well, they have to think about these things, perhaps. Um, and frequently, if you're on like various varieties of TikTok, you're probably not thinking about those things. You're thinking about other things. But there are critical sides of TikTok. There's critical sides of almost everything. YouTube.
So you're getting them, they're playing with the
Yeah,
technologies, but they're thinking very deeply about,
yeah. So who's
how they're
controlling it?
structuring their learning,
Right.
their experience.
Well, there's
Yeah.
a concept from about the early 2000s. And it was supposed to transform the university, as almost everything has been supposed to transform the university.
That's
Right?
what they're saying about Gen AI right now.
Oh, yeah. Everything will always transform the university because academics change so quickly and knowledge changes so fast. But it was the personal learning environment, right? So, what technologies are you choosing to learn with?
Mm-hmm.
And what technologies are being are you surrounding yourself with that you were learning from? At the time, it was like Wikipedia was fairly untrusted and other things at the time, but people were making arguments about that, so wikis should be more included in it. But everything is part of your personal learning environment. When you go walking in the woods, that can be just as revelatory as any internet
Mm-hmm.
type of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, you really have to talk with students about, like, and I was just talking with my a colleague about this before I came here. It's like the first day of class, you have to talk with them about the way humans learn, right? Because a lot of them are very confused. For a very long time, people have been telling them that they have learning styles, which we know are complete fictions now, fictions of theory, which happen.
Mm-hmm.
People mostly learn mostly the same way. There's a little variation, but we're pretty sure they learn the same way. Um, And a style doesn't matter. Now, preference might help. If you prefer listening to music, that might help. But it also might hinder. It goes both ways.
Yep. Yep.
So there's nothing there between those sort of media styles that is going to make you learn better. Like looking at the internet isn't going to make you learn better than looking at a television show. You're learning things from both those things. But the question is, what's worth learning? And that's in my classroom, what's worth learning. My job is to model what's worth learning, right? For me. But then you run into the perpetual bias of the professor teaches what the professor wants you to learn, right? And that's a perpetual bias because the other thing that I always say to all my colleagues is our students aren't like us. They're humans, they're students like we were, but they aren't professors, and they're probably not going to be professors. Maybe one in your classroom will be a professor. They have entirely different goals. And those goals matter to them even if they don't recognize them or can't even iterate or explain them.
Can I link that to your approach to assessment? Because you do provide students with choices. Again, they can choose how their learning happens and how they show their learning through assessments. One of the things that you do that is very innovative is specification grading. So I have never seen anything like this before. So talk just a little bit about, how you're setting up the specification grading. Because students have to make choices, and they have to make them at the beginning of the course.
Well, they get some leeway. They can pretty much make, up until about 2/3 of the way, they can probably shift around. But they have to be thinking about the grade they want at the end of the course at the start. But shouldn't they always be thinking about that, right?
But
I mean, they really shouldn't.
This really brings highlights. It brings it forward, right?
Well, it's an argument about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. How do we get them to move from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation? How do we get them to learn for their own sake and not learn for the sake of the grade? And the basic idea with specifications grading is that you transfer the responsibility of the grades away from the professor, right? And you say, you want whatever grade you want. Here it is. This is what you have to do
to get that grade.
To get that grade.
Yeah.
And you make it as clear as you can. Sometimes you can't, one of my famous sayings that my students say is, if I tell you how to get an A, then it's a B. Because an A exceeds a B. But if I give you directions for it, then you're just following directions. And then that would be a B. Right?
Yeah. What are you doing in addition?
Right. What are you doing that exceeds it and makes it exceptional? That's the question. Now, frequently they're like, well, anymore, the A is just the fancy B. And I understand the argument, and that's a very valid argument. Grade inflation does happen. But if they want to be exceptional, they should think about what they have to do that is exceptional. And they hate that saying. But it's very true. It's like, I tell a lot of my colleagues that I think we should get rid of everything except A, C, and F. Either you are doing well, and that's a C. Either you're exceeding that in some substantive way, and that's an A. Or if you're not doing well, that's an F. And the clearer the message we can provide on these things, the better.
Yeah.
Right? And the problem with all the pluses and minuses is like I grew up in the United States. I went to an engineering university, and A was 93 and above. It's like, and there was no A plus.
85.
Yeah. And I still don't know what it means to have an A plus. How do you exceed an A when an A is as good as you're supposed to be able to get? Now, I understand the historical genesis of these things and how they come about and our grading system and all that, but it's still conceptual. It's like when somebody first came up to me and said, do your students self-plagiarize? And I looked at them and I said, that makes no sense. Like self-plagiarism makes no sense because plagiarism is about taking someone else's idea and using
passing them off as your own. So how do you pass
can't
off your
do
own
that
ideas?
with your own ideas. My first degree was in philosophy. And so these contradictions always get me in the head. It's like, you can't really have an A plus. You can't exceed as good, the good as you can. And so it's like the 80 and above, 85 and above, I can modify up and down on that. just a scalar relation, though it took me a while, and my students were all getting very good grades for a while.
And to
But
figure out how to work that out. But you
yeah,
you create them as bundles,
yeah.
and those bundles are, different
Yeah.
projects, different
So you have
reports or reviews.
research.
But it
Yeah.
also includes participation and
Mhm.
attendance.
Yes.
So
Because
that's part of the bundle.
yeah, and if you don't do that, then um, students, I mean, we all have the problem. Everybody was talking about it since 2 years before the pandemic, maybe 3 years before pandemic, participation was hitting the tank. I remember the debates
Yeah.
in
Yep.
in DAC back then,
Why?
and it's still in
Yeah.
the tank. Like I have colleagues in various departments that are getting 25% and
Yeah.
sometimes less, and I'm
Yeah.
like, so what are the other students learning?
Mhm.
Now, don't get me wrong. If you were to give me a 700-person class, and I've been in 700-person classes, um, and we had one person that was just a superior note taker, and I was in that class, I would be paying that superior note
Yeah.
taker like $5 to go to class so I didn't have to, because why would I waste my time if it's just about sitting there taking notes?
So then what's the value added?
Right. What
are you doing in the
right,
class that's pulling people
right,
in and engaging them?
right.
Absolutely.
So bundles came along when I started doing like really significant active learning where they were doing something all the time. Um, and so that's where learning reports came in too. It's like, why should my construction of the learning be the only one that is valid,
Mhm.
right? Um, Now, I'm the expert in the material, and I will tell them whether it's right or wrong, or whether their interpretation
Yeah.
needs work, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a thing. But that doesn't mean theirs is invalid. So, what if I no longer was the arbiter of this grade, but they made that decision? And then with a learning report, they would tell me exactly what they learned,
So there
right?
would be sort of a
Right,
more
right.
like a reporter or
Yeah,
a formal assessment, a
yeah.
paper, research paper,
We
something.
would have that as the top,
Right. But then there would
a
be
learning report.
some kind of reflection.
Yeah.
Yeah, learning report.
So that's usually for
Yep.
the people that want B plus or below. Research is usually A's or above, A's and A pluses. And then sometimes there's book reports they can do that go down, into the C's. And then again, I do not understand the concept of a D minus. If it's unsatisfactory, why isn't it just an F? How do you get lower than an
It's a good question. It's a good question. Yeah.
So there's these contradictions, and we're communicating these things with our students structurally in our university and telling them this is all a rational system. They have to be going, this is not rational. So on taking that satellite, it's like, I want them to be developed into fully sort of thinking subjects, right?
Mhm.
That's the goal of a liberal arts education. Well, critical thinking citizens, well thought critical thinking citizens, something like this. So why not give them the power to do that, right?
So how do they react when they see these bundles, right? And there's a choice, like actually, if you want to be, here's what you need to do. And in that bundle, it's not only participation and attendance, it's actually saying if you miss
Mm-hmm.
more than
Yes. Mm-hmm.
one class or two classes or three classes, right?
Yeah.
That's part of a bundle,
Mhm.
and you're going to go down a bundle kind of
Yeah.
thing.
No.
So it's quite a comprehensive
Yeah.
package. So
Yeah.
what do students say?
Well, we also have the university accepted excuse. So if it's an excuse that's accepted at the
Yeah,
university, I have to,
yes, yeah.
that's
Fair enough.
fair enough.
But you're setting
Yeah.
expectations.
No, I mean, and you have to, right?
Yeah.
If you don't, it's like, what students don't complain about it. Like I get the
Nobody
minor.
comes afterwards and says, "Oh, I didn't really understand that if I missed 4 classes, then I
No.
couldn't do bundle
No, they
A
say
or B."
things like, I was really aiming for the B plus, and I didn't do this. Is there any way I could get extra credit? That's what they say.
Yes, and you say
Right.
no.
And I
That was
say
the bundle.
the extra credit has to be done in the course as
Yeah.
per the syllabus.
Yes.
So it's beyond the last day of course.
Specification grading.
and
It's
so
specified.
so there is no more
Yeah.
extra credit. I'm sorry, and you get your B minus or your B or your C plus. And some of them might think that's unfair, but here's the weird thing about specifications grading is it tends to either break it tends to break bimodally to
Yeah.
people who really want to
I can see
excel
that. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
people that sort of want to pass the course.
Yeah. They just need the credit.
And that's what happens. Of course, I'm told I haven't done 353 in a while where we do this, and 213 I did this a lot. I'm doing different things in different courses. Um, my colleague told me that last year nobody aimed for the research section. Now I'm wondering if this is something that um, is because of the way it's sort of the last group that had 2 years of
Yeah.
and this could just
Yeah.
be a thing that's happening.
Lost learning.
Yeah, lost learning, and this is just an after effect of lowered expectations of their own learning. Um, we hear stories of the same thing around when we dropped grade 13, right? I wasn't here for that,
Yeah.
but the same sort of thing. There's repercussions. It lasted 10 years into the thing.
Yes, there were. I
Yeah,
remember that very well.
right. And
Yeah.
so it's
A few years
yeah.
prior, a few years after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of transferring responsibility and accepting responsibility for that transference, and then saying, it's not meant to be unfair, right?
Mhm.
The goal is to give you the power of choice.
Absolutely.
And when they realize that they can do what they want, they start making those choices. The problem, of course, is it exists in an environment where I think we generally probably have 3 courses at any time with this type of grading strategy at max, maybe 4 or 5 with other departments going on. So students are choosing these courses that like these courses, and students that don't like them don't choose them, right? And that's one of the problems you always have is a student that knows they're going to be successful in a lecture course will tend to aim for the lecture courses. The students
Yeah.
that tend to be successful,
Self-selecting
right?
out.
But that's becoming harder and harder for students to do.
Yeah. I
Um,
think there's a lot more innovation happening in the
Yeah.
classroom in terms, and a lot more sort of a greater variety in terms of assessment.
Yeah,
But
and there's going to have to be more greater
yeah. One of the things, though, or another thing that really comes through, though, in your dossier is that at the same time that you're giving students choices over their learning and challenging them in different ways, you're also mentoring them. You're
Yeah.
also supporting them in a whole bunch of different ways.
Well, that's what we do, right?
Yes, but I mean, you're doing it within the confines of a course, and you're doing it outside of the course as well. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your mentoring approach.
I would be here except for my mentors,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's like I'm a farm kid from northern Pennsylvania that paid for his bachelor's degree with the military service, right?
Mhm.
The long hair is a statement of rebellion that you can't make me cut it anymore. I also cut it. I grow it out and cut it now and donate it. That's what I did last time.
Mm.
I have been around some fantastic people in my education, as almost all of us that have made it this far. We've
Yeah.
had some terrors. There's been some bad ones. Everybody has,
There's people along the way
right.
that they're
Right.
lifting you
Yeah,
up,
and there's
right?
right.
Showing you the way.
And I wouldn't be here without them. I had a great undergraduate advisor. I would never put myself as a good undergraduate advisor because I have certain talents, and I'm not the best with some of the undergraduate stuff. I'm pretty good at the graduate stuff. But when an undergraduate comes up to me and says, "Professor Hunsinger, I should be making 150,000 when I graduate," and it's like, by whose clock? I don't even make, and it's like that. I used to do this thing in my first year class when I was teaching first year classes where I would have them do this thing. It's like, how much do you expect to make when you graduate? And they would all come back like 75,000. Then you tell them, it's been 50,000 for a few years now.
Yeah.
And they say, okay, how much you're going to be making 5 years after you graduate? And it's always like 150, 200,000. It's like, you look at Canadian demographics, and so you would introduce them to sort
Yeah.
of analyzing what happens in Canada, and we do have far more social mobility than the United States right now, by I think a power of by 1 power of 10, but or something like this, but it's still not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so they need to have those sort of reality checks. But my mentorship with students is once they've taken my courses, they can rely on me for a recommendation. They can rely on me for any sort of question they have. I have students still that, um, like I have one she's on her third year doctoral review, right? And I'm still mentoring, they're
Mhm.
asking questions, I'm still answering. Would I do it that way? I would not do it that way. Would I do it that way? Yeah, that's the way I would do it. This type of thing. Um, with the advice is, don't always do the way that I did it because it might not be the most successful, but, if it's sensible, and you can justify it,
Mhm.
that's reasonable.
Mhm.
Um, but, um, but yeah, it's like one of the best things, well, parts of many people's lives is this university experience. Um, and Laurier being what it is, we give them an experience. And
Yeah.
I'm part of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and in that I'm part of that, I think that I have a responsibility to those that ally with me, that take my courses, that find them worthwhile, to take care of them in the more or less, sadly, traditional manner, of being a professor with, students and graduate students. And, if they came back to me 20 years from now and, had a question, I would answer it.
Mhm.
And that's just the way it is. And I get those questions, and sometimes you get the nice notes in the mail, and sometimes you get that, and that's all wonderful and great too. But the idea is that I have a responsibility to make the path is for others, as much as it was made for me,
Mhm.
right? Um, Now, we aren't a PhD granting department. We could be sometime in the future. Um, but a lot of our students aren't seeking that. So they aren't seeking to be like me. Some of them might be, but there's what they're seeking in life. I have advice on.
Mhm.
My students are always
Mhm.
amazed. It's like, yes, I was a chief technology officer of a startup company for a very short period of time. I've done a lot more than you think I have.
Yeah.
I'm 51 this year, whatever. Um, you know, um, but I spent a lot, I worked in a university almost my whole life, but most of it wasn't tenure track. I think we're just breaking tenure. Well, no, I spent 18 years as non-tenure track,
Mhm.
working as mostly as a director of a research center.
Mhm.
Um, so I've done all kinds of things that people don't expect of me, but other people make it made my whole career possible. And so my job is to say, look, if you need advice, if you need help, if you need have a question about something going on, just ask. And that,
Mhm.
you start in the classroom with the principle of just ask. I don't get as many emails as many of my colleagues do, but the emails that I get are usually pertinent, and worth following up on
Yeah.
and helping somebody with.
Yeah.
Um, and then in terms of helping, I help a lot of people that aren't Laurier related at all. Um, I'm affiliated with several academic organizations. I help get two or three started, um, depending on, well,
You're a networker.
yeah,
That really comes through in your
yeah.
dossier.
My job is to take people that, you know, I think should be successful and help them become successful.
Yeah.
And that is people doing great work around the world. Um, and I do that in a wide variety of ways. It's like, sometimes people are surprised. Like I just had one colleague, junior colleague, she's going on the market. And I'm like, has anybody sent you their successful materials yet? Like the stuff they got jobs with. She's like, no,
Mhm.
nobody's even offered it. Like, well, here's my 3 CVs that got me offers. Here's my letters that I used for those things. Um, I'm not like you, don't take that wrong, but this is the way I frame things. This is the way
Yeah.
it worked, and
Yeah.
it worked for me back then. It might not work today, but
But having those
yeah.
exemplars is really
And
helpful. Yeah.
it's so like I keep basically a packet aside for people that need it, and I just send that. I also willingly will, if you ask to see the letter that I write for you, um, I will show you the letter I write for you because I have seen some pretty atrocious letters out there
Mhm.
because we've all been on, and
Yes.
it's like,
Yeah.
why would you do that? It's
Mhm.
like, I remember once reading, it's a canonical example. I think a lot of people have, but it was theoretical. It was for a political theory position, and I was not on the committee, but I was uh, a member of the department, and so I got to read them. And like somebody had a famous scholar write a letter for him, and the famous scholar clearly didn't like the person because it said, "I met this person at a conference." Period.
Oh, no.
Right?
Yeah.
So how's the
Yeah.
committee supposed to take this? It's like,
Exactly.
this is not a letter of reference at any level. And, I've seen some brilliant ones. We have many colleagues that write brilliant letters. And some of my prior colleagues have shared them with me. I know how to do it, and I write them in the American style, which is perhaps a little over the top, but that's what we do in that. So
I'm sure the students appreciate
yeah,
it. I'm sure
so
they do.
well,
Yeah.
and then they get the feel for little like I did work at Laurier. I did, it. People recognized what I did, and it was successful, and that's important for them. Like 2-3 years after the fact, it's like people are always online saying my degree meant nothing to my current job. Well, your degree got you the current job, and you probably would be surprised at how much you're actually using there. I always used to assign a book. I used to call it the 5-year book, and it would vary class to class. Because I came up in philosophy, and most of my classes were teaching ancient and medieval philosophy, and then I started teaching contemporary, ancient medieval political theory and contemporary political theory. And I was teaching those for many years before I got here. And so I'd always assign like one book that was like, okay, they're not going to really get it today, but in 5 years, I'm going to start getting the emails. And it was usually something like Ulrich Beck's Brave New World of Work or something like that.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, this book so describes my current work situation so much. So thank you for assigning it.
Yeah,
I'm happy
that's
I
right.
read it. You
Yeah,
get
that's
these
right.
emails like 5 years later. And it's like the 5-year book was an important thing for me to think about back then. And then I started to realize that the 5-year book should actually be like a 2-year book, should be a 1-year book, and should be,
Yeah.
pack into the past book. So it should be them relating their curriculars all the way through in my classes and other people's classes through, to give them the reflexive thing is like, this is where I am now, and I actually am doing well.
Yeah.
And frequently they are doing well.
But you've,
unless,
they're in large part they're doing well because you have, supported them. One of the wonderful things about putting together an award nomination dossier, and it's a lot of work.
yeah, thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, but it really gives you the opportunity to look back and to reflect on your own teaching practice. So what's next for you? You've taught a very large number of courses, right? That
Yeah.
comes through in your package. You have innovated in, many different ways in terms of classroom practice, active learning, experiential learning, field courses, different kinds of assessment. You mentor students in different ways. What's next for you?
I'm hoping the field course keeps going. Of course, that'll depend on budgetary restrictions.
Yes, and this was the course
yeah.
where you took students to study beer in Europe.
Beer,
Yes.
culture, and communication,
Yes.
which, you can do anything plus culture and communication. I just happen to have a background in understanding of beer and food. So my parents
Speaking
were
of
chefs.
convivial.
Yes, and that's part of it.
Yeah.
People need to look at how other cultures do things differently. And so many, I'm reading the learning reports on it now. It's like one of the things I challenged them to do in their notes when they finished their notes was to write off, this thing is about how this course may or may not change my life. And it's like, and so many of them are writing, the way people were enjoying themselves at British pubs, the way people were enjoying themselves at Belgium beer bars is fantastically different than I drink with my friends.
Yeah.
Like I
It's about how they're living their lives.
And it's about
reflecting on that.
And if 5 of them take that lesson away of like alcohol can make some parts more enjoyable sometimes and can make some things better, but really doesn't work like that. The alcohol is just about making friends, and working with the friendship network. It's a supportive structure. If they get that little bit along with that, and that the cultural differences matter as much as other things around that. There's so much they learned. It's just amazing what they've told me. So I'd like to keep that one going and basically rotate it off between beer, communication culture and food communication culture, because I think students think a lot about food, but they don't think deeply about food, just like they don't think deeply about beer. Um, you know, beer is beer, right? But it isn't.
No.
It's fantastically different, and people have different tastes. It's more complicated than wine. There's a broader array of tastes that are acceptable.
It defines what community is.
Yeah, it defines, so much, ideologically and otherwise. And now political statement beer has been a thing since at least Billy Beer. I don't know if you remember Billy Beer, Jimmy Carter's little brother, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And that type of thing. I've taught in 7 different fields so far. Um, I think, you know, a lot of what I'm doing now makes me very happy in the classroom. Um, I don't know how much specifications grading is going to stay around. It's not that I don't like it or it doesn't work. It just, I think the bimodality creates a little structural unfairness for some of the students. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's fairly clear in the structure of it. I mean,
I mean,
um,
I think the reality though is that any
yeah,
grading structure that you use
yeah,
is,
it has structural
not
unfairness.
it's not gonna it's
Yeah,
not gonna catch
yeah.
everybody.
I think the way I'm teaching now, with actually integrating the technology, getting them to be aware of that, integrating their everyday life, integrating their past courses, active learning consistently, that's the way I think it has to go. And I think the evaluation has to go to, until we transition a little bit about this current problematic AI situation into a more individual face-to-face evaluation systems, because otherwise everything can be simulated, right?
Yeah.
I mean, my courses are harder to simulate than others because I can ask them what they did in their workshops,
Yeah.
and what they learned from the workshops, and an AI cannot say that because the AI was not there. Um, but not everybody has that. So there's going to be more in situ sort of passive evaluation in the classes, I think, than I was doing in the past. So the participation grade will actually have more meaning than just, making sure you're participating. There'll probably be values in there somehow. But yeah, the future is basically what belies us with technology. I mean, my job is to keep up with the technology and keep ahead of the technology with the students. Um,
Yeah, well,
and
that's
right,
incredibly useful.
yeah,
That's incredibly useful.
like same. Dr. Rambakan is the same way. We have different focuses. Mine is more on infrastructures. His is more on sexualities, and but they're still contemporary technologies.
Yeah.
Is what we work a lot. So do other people in the department too. Um, and so, um, keeping up with that and keeping. I mean, I think what was it I discovered when I redid this package is that I developed 44 courses since I've been here.
Yeah.
Just amazing amount that I haven't reflected upon. But yeah, it's like that, keeping in front of this, helping students be aware of their situatedness in it.
Yeah, helping them,
Right,
just
right. It's
think
like,
about how they're engaging with the world
right.
around them too. Yeah.
Well, I grew up with radios. Radios still mattered. They don't even really, they have things they call radios that aren't radios anymore. You know, television isn't television anymore. The old joke is, there was one television in a household, right? And we all used to share it. And now they usually have 3 to 4 televisions on their body, their watch, 1 or 2 phones, and a computer or 2, you know, and those are
Yeah.
all televisions now. And they're all, everything has access to all the
And
information
you're
they need.
guiding students through that.
So yeah, and it's a different world, and our world is changing too. No matter how much you want to say, okay, we have to throw all this away and retreat back to nature. And don't get me wrong, I'm for taking retreats too. I think students should break their phone addiction every now and then, and even though it might cause some of them anxiety, they should try to do it to feel that anxiety. Um, so I
Absolutely.
do that and think in 325, it's an option. One of the optional assignments you can do, as amongst many, is to take a phone break, and many of them do not do well with a phone break anymore. Whereas 10 years ago, phone break wasn't so bad, right? My strategies are basically trying to keep in front of the technologies, and um, I don't think any of my real what's called as innovations are necessarily innovations. They're just things I've picked up along the way or thought about, or a lot of it comes out of there's a journal called Curriculum Inquiry. I don't know if you've ever seen Curriculum
Mm-mm.
Inquiry. You weren't allowed to call things critical for a while, right? Back in the
Right.
early
Yeah.
80s.
Yeah.
It's always founded back in the early 80s, but it was basically critical curriculum studies. It was called Curriculum Inquiry. And then in the early 2000s, one of the founders of that journal and I and another guy started one called Learning Inquiry, sort of as a theme to throw back to that. And the question is how do they learn? So I'm not, mostly what I'm about is I could, not really care about lots of stuff that has to be going on as long as I can get them to learn, and get them to learn the materials that I need them to learn in the curriculum structures that I'm provided. So that's why I'm like teaching, like my is secondary to me.
Yeah.
Getting them to learn is primary. And if I can do that using a technology, if I can do that getting active learning, if I can get them out in the world learning and learning the materials I need them to learn for this course, that's what I want to do.
And your students
Right.
are fortunate
Yeah.
indeed. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today to reflect on your teaching practice. And I want to take your beer field course the next time it's offered. My thanks to Jeremy Hunsinger for joining me today, and I hope you will join me for more conversations that celebrate exceptional teaching practices, explore diverse teaching philosophies, and discuss the future of higher education teaching and learning.